So, I've been thinking a little bit, as I've wanted to do a YouTube channel for a while. It's quite difficult, We don't have any video editing software, and, I might be going to study theology next year. Right now, it's just something I'm very interested in. But, and I've been trying to put together videos, but they all feel very unorganic, and they don't feel like I'm being honest when I talk about them, because it's so heavily constructed that it really just misses out, I think, on the blunt truth of it. So I just thought I would turn on the camera and sort of do a bit of a rambling video about a given topic, and upload that whenever I've got the time and space. When no one else is around, I can just walk around the house carrying my laptop, just, wearing this shitty headset and discuss. Do all kinds of stuff. Make myself a drink. So, I watched The Atheist Experience. I think it's a very interesting show. I don't think they do such a good job of talking to the theists in question. But while watching, I did come to quite a revelation, which is not an argument I've heard used by Christians before. Atheists. Gotta love you. Must have some cherry Pepsi Max. So, let's talk about God. So, I'm going to be speaking specifically to Christians here. I live in a Christian country. Christianity is what I became fascinated with ever since I left the religion, right? And, God is a very interesting figure, right? Because you have to consider what it's like to be omnipotent and omniscient. Now, a lot of atheists like to talk about a paradox that's created, and I think it's a very important paradox to point out. Because I think it's an argument that's one step away from being a very valid criticism of religion, but I think in its current form it's not, and it's the omnipotent omniscience paradox, which is omnipotence basically argues that you can do anything you like. You've got infinite power, you can create, you can destroy, reality changes at your whim. You are powerful enough to not be confined by time and space. Spell this laptop in for a bit. And I think that's a very interesting concept. I like to write a lot in my spare time, so I actually understand changing things on a whim, right? But that's how Christians tend to view God, is almost like a writer writing a book. But there's a fundamental difference, because a writer is not omnipotent in their own world. And this is why they're not, because they do not have omniscience. I think omniscience is key to omnipotence, because a writer can never know exactly what they're going to write in 4 drafts from now. Writers have to write again and again and again. God doesn't get to do that. God is omniscient, so he would know what's in the 4th draft, and he would just go with the 4th draft to begin with, right? And this is 4th draft being generous. I mean, God could jump to the final perfect draft, the perfect work, because he will know what that perfect work is. And being omnipotent, he can make that happen. And I think that's incredibly important, because this is when the last part of the atheistic argument comes in, is where it talks about benevolence. Now, I actually think benevolence is fundamentally a flawed concept, and I don't think is necessarily one all Christians agree with. Because being all-loving means that you want what's best for people. The only problem is you'll have a different idea of what's good for people. I mean, some people think it's very important for them to live lives of comfort and to be able to live with peace of mind and peace of heart. And others believe that loving someone is to let them do what they want, let them have their own freedom, to have liberty. America, for example, was founded on liberty and freedom. So fundamentally, omnibenevolence is incredibly hard to define, because you can have an infinite amount of love, but not by everyone's definition will it be love. Additionally, someone's love is defined almost entirely by the person that is giving that love, right? So an abusive husband uses the same word love as the world's greatest boyfriend who drops everything to look after their girlfriend who is in a hospital for 3 months. I mean, so by the very word unlimited love, that's where you have a problem. And I think that's where the trifectal argument of the paradox falls apart, because God might have a different definition of love to what everyone else does. But what it does mean is that God is trying to enforce his idea of love, and it will always be the same kind of love throughout. And this is where we come across the major problem, which is the two gods of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Now, if we look historically, we know that the Old and New Testaments aren't written by people at the time, for the most part. And if they are written at the time, they're not written by people who directly know or witnessed the events that happened. Now, Christians can debate this all they like. The fact of the matter is there isn't a single first-hand eyewitness testimony that was written at the time and recorded as such. And in fact, the four Gospels and so on actually say that they're not written by people at the time, and actually it's just the Jewish tradition. So, remembering that the love has to be constant, we can see that the Old and the New Testament clearly show that there are two different kinds of love in place here. Because the Old Testament is all about the original Jewish tradition of the Jewish people, the nomadic Jewish people, and God's love for them as sort of his fate, as his chosen people. And God will, dash people upon the earth, and he'll make their walls come crumbling down and slaughter people who hurt Jewish children. It's very clear that he has an endless love for the Jewish people that is a fervent and protective love, almost like a guard dog, They love their owners endlessly, and they will viciously attack anyone who hurts them. And God has sort of that same incredibly viciously protective love for the Jewish people in the Old Testament. But come to the New Testament, and it shows something else entirely, because at this point in time, the Jewish people are no longer really nomadic. They've gone all in their different directions, and they are across the world, And the Jews are just living as people in Rome. And this character of Jesus, who, again, is really just Jewish folklore by the time that he's recorded. And no one's entirely sure, apart from the overall message he gives, in which there are some slight differences. For example, he's still a bit violent when people desecrate his father's church. Some argue he's an avatar. All of that kind of stuff. It's very important to consider that there are slight differences between Jesus, but I think, again, that's a flawed argument from atheists because, different people have different perspectives, and I think whilst it convinces me, it might not convince a theist. But what the important point here is what Jesus says, because Jesus is meant to be the Son of God, if not the avatar of God. But what's clear is that Jesus is one of God's prophets who is infused with his essence. And I think was hard to discern what Jesus is meant to be. I would say Jesus is kind of like an angel crossed with a human, a divine being given human flesh with God's will and knowledge cradled within him. And it's pretty clear that Jesus is omnipotent. He's meant to be everything God is. He has power over life and death. He has power over sickness. And it's sort of a wonder why he doesn't do more, but that's a whole another topic I'm not going to go into. But it's very clear that he's meant to understand God's true message. And this is why this argument does not work for Judaism, because they do not accept Jesus. But it does work for Christianity. So, again, Jesus is clearly meant to be a continuation of meant to have all of the benevolence that God has. I mean, it's, pretty self-evident to the Christian religion. Now, here's the fundamental difference, is God's the guard dog. What does Jesus say when the Jewish people are attacked? He specifically says, turn the other cheek. Now, turn the other cheek is actually a phrase, and it's one that's often misinterpreted by a lot of people who read it, but Christian scholars and everyone else would agree that it means total pacifism. If you get punched in the cheek, show them your other cheek. This is the same thing that Gandhi said, essentially. A complete policy of non-violence. Let them hit you. You will not fight back. And that is not the attitude that God had in the Old Testament. It certainly shows a different kind of love, which is a love for everyone, of a desire for peace, of a sort of more calm and tranquil-minded love. Like Gandhi had. It's like comparing Winston Churchill's love for Britain, where he sent men off to war and he destroyed people, with Gandhi's love for India. I think they are similar, and they are both forms of love, and they are both forms of love that I think that are worth talking about and noting as forms of love, but they're different kinds of love. But God would have to have a perfect kind of love. And he has two different kinds of love, and not both of them can be omnibenevolence. Other examples, around the time there were a lot of Jewish people stoning people to death, and it was clear that in the Old Testament, God's idea of love was creating a civil and although strict, stable society. That was what he wanted. That's why he had Moses stone people to death. Create all of these laws. Yet Jesus said, "Let the sinner, the man who has never sinned, cast the first stone." That's not really what God said in the Old Testament. What God said in the Old Testament is, if you have sinned greatly towards me and not repented, you get stoned. Doesn't matter who stones it, he makes no reference to that. So, this is where it's clear that there are two different kinds of love between the Old and the New Testament. One is protective, violent love, love that is violent towards your enemies, and pacifist, calm love, which is loving to everyone for, the continuation of humanity rather than the Jewish society. So not only does God expand his circle of love come the New Testament, but it's a different kind of love. And of course, we've already explained the omnipotence, the omniscience, and the benevolence. He will already be at the understanding of what's the perfect way for people to live, right? He will already be at the final draft of the book. He will be all-loving. So God will... sorry, just allow me to collect my thoughts a second. Remember, this is rambling. I'll just take another sip of drink. Yeah. So I'm just going to summarize quickly before we get to the final part of the argument. So, omniscience and omnipotence are not a paradox if the benevolence is one kind of love that not everyone agrees with, right? There are two different kinds of love. Now here's where we can sort of suggest that actually it is just folklore, because let's look at British folklore. They believed that women who lived on their own tended to be witches or something like that. Women on their own are not to be trusted, and that's because they valued women being part of a family and contributing to the community. The Celts believed that children who ran off would be kidnapped by spirits in the woods. It's just a fundamental idea of don't let your kids go into the woods. The ideas that protect their society and help their society run as it currently is are what make up their folklore and make up their mythological beliefs that they do actually end up believing. And what were the Jewish nomadic people like? Well, we don't know for sure that everything that was said happened, but in the ancient era, before the classical era, which is about the time that Jesus was around, it was, you come across another tribe, and you either murder them, walk away, or join. And that's basically what the Jews did. They accepted people in or murdered all of them. It was a very simple time, but what was clear was the Jews are what matter. The Jewish people are what will always be pushed forward. Come the Roman era, when they're settled and part of a society and a community, and the message is entirely different. It's one of living with your oppressors, of letting your oppressors hit you. Because that's what was safest, and that was what suited best the Jewish society at the time. And an omnipotent, omniscient God would not be beholden to the love of the God and the love of would not be beholden to the folklore and the ideas of the time. And in fact, this ends up showing, meaning there are only a few conclusions that can be reached. A, the Christian God does not exist. B, Jesus did not exist, but the Christian God does, which is what leads you to Judaism. Now, we could talk about the Old Testament another time. God lies for, no reason. It's one of these, and God lying and being a deceiver, at what point could he trust anything they say at that point, that God says at that point? It's very possible that if that's the case, God's making up the entire thing and just wants to create a more stable society for everyone to live in, so he'll make up anything on the spot. But what I think is the most likely is that people, we don't know how it began, we don't know the original thing, but we don't know how a lot of mythological figures began. What we do know is that the historical story of Jesus given was not correct. For example, King Herod died 50 years before Jesus was supposedly born. Now, the Christians can maybe give a 4-year leeway based on who was emperor at the time and the name change. But 50 years is much too large. The Gospels themselves contradict on who Jesus was. And when you're asking who Jesus is, when there's no clear definition from an infallible, omniscient God who will be on the final judgment, who will know exactly what message he needs to send out, who he needs to send prophets to. And he would know what would happen what would happen once people began reading the Bible themselves. And he would know that would happen. So there's only one other option, which is that God is not omniscient. Now, I can accept omnipotence. I don't think omnipotence itself makes much sense because of the rock paradox. Infinity itself creates a lot of confusion. But I think a maximally powerful being makes sense. But with the Christian faith, an omniscient God is not possible. Fundamentally, you either have to admit, if you have been following this argument truthfully, in the end, God will not be omniscient. He either will not be omniscient, or he has lied, or he has through the Christian church, fabricated an entire story to try and create a more peaceful society. At which point, I think round about now, he should really be kicking himself, because it's been proven that secular humanism actually leads to more peaceful members of society. Now, before you get upset, emotional reaction, if you're a theist who's watching, I'm going to explain this to you. So, secular humanism, a lot of religions say, well, our morality comes from God. Well, as much as we don't like to think about it being anything like that, and that it's not from God and that it's just how it is. The fact of the matter is that psychopaths exist. Autistic people who don't understand basic social function. There are abnormalities in our society that show that not everyone is infused with morality. You could say, well, that's a flaw in their spirit, that's a flaw in their soul and their morality. Except they can be born with birth defects in their brains that cause those exact problems. Morality can't come from God, if that's the case. And if it comes from the Bible, then I would ask why Hinduism teaches a code of ethics, why Buddhism teaches a code of ethics, while the Quran doesn't. They're not the same code of ethics as Christianity has. But if we go to who follows the law of the current society, who keeps the peace and acts in a civilized way, because fundamentally that's what morality is, acting in a civilized way, atheists are far underrepresented in demographics. I don't know the statistics for here in the UK, but I know in America, atheists make up about, I want to say it's like 14% of the population. They're like 0.03% of the prison population. Atheists are far less likely to be incarcerated for crimes. I know it's true here for the UK, I just can't bring the numbers off the top of my head. And here's why. Because religion actually teaches nothing about morality, and it just enforces your own current beliefs. Now, you might not believe that, but neuroscience says otherwise. Now, what could neuroscience have to say about it? Well, they can read your brain when you're thinking about morality. So they ran a test. I can't remember the exact test. You can look it up. They ran a test where they were scanning people's brains while they asked them what they thought of different people's morality. Hitler, Gandhi, I say John Lennon. I don't know who the exact people were. But, oh, sorry. The part of the brain that deals with reason would be the one that reacted to all of those kinds of answers. And without making it special, without flipping the script, without making it obvious that it was any different, they asked about God. And this time, reason didn't spark up. It's a part of the brain that deals with the idea of the self. Because, think about it, does your God disagree with you on anything morally? And then ask, do you morally agree with everyone in your church? Because the answer will be no. That's because you do not agree morally with everyone in your church. Because morality is separate. That's just the end of it. Morality is separate from God and your religion. That's just what all the evidence shows. So God would know that secular humanism, he's an omniscient, omniscient being. He could have weaved humanism into our very being, and we would be a more civilized society. So that's the crux of my argument. It's possibly one of the strongest reasons I have not to believe in God. This video is like 24 minutes long. It won't be that long to explain it, but it's a very comprehensive argument. I think I'll do another one of these videos. I definitely want to tackle conservative versus socialist economics at some point. I'm not just going to do religion. I'd like to thank you for watching. If you have any disagreements or anything, leave them in the comments. I know there's going to be like 5 people who watch this, but I am genuinely really interested to know what you think. I'd like to thank you for watching, and I will see you whenever I decide to do another rambling video.